And we're back to talk about, what JC and Toby learned at the MWC and related events in Barcelona last week about, MCP apps, agentic AI, and like all the good things that we, try to study here. And I can't wait to dig into it. But first, I'm Ray Deck. I'm a founder over at State Change AI, where we work on the harder parts of AI challenges, of which MCP apps are definitely in that category. And that's why I'm excited to be here with JC and Toby again today. And maybe we can just do very quick intros, gentlemen, and then we can dig into what you got to learn in Barcelona. Toby, can we start with you, sir?
Sure. I'm Toby, CEO of Algo Design, trying to learn more about MCP and MCP apps and what people are thinking about them.
JC. Hi, everyone. I'm a product designer and developer, and we're here today in another session to just share what we keep learning about AI, MCP apps, and everything related to it. And before I give it up to Toby, I wanted to introduce a bit about what we did last week. So we went to different conferences and events that were happening here in Barcelona. And basically, it was really interesting because it was a myriad of different people, builders, companies, startups sharing knowledge, experimenting, and also a lot of recruitment, which also signals there's a lot of movement in the space. And maybe we can start with the first meetup or event that we went to. What do you think, Toby?
Yeah, last week we went to as a meetup organized by the K Fund, which is a VC based in Spain, which I used to do some work for actually. And they had brought in a bunch of peak companies who they knew to talk about like AI and what people have been doing. And I think there was some interesting things there. What was most interesting for me is we went up to them afterwards and asked them about how they're thinking about MCP and MCP apps. And the general consensus, which is a theme that I had actually a lot over the last few days, is MCP doesn't really work for us. What we're really excited about is about building an agent or AI into their product. So they're focused on using AI to make their product easier to use, and helping users get the most out of it. And I think this is something that I've mentioned before a little bit. I think this kind of misses a lot of the value and really kind of misses what MCP is all about. MCP is all about kind of inverting that, and rather than putting AI into your product, MCP helps you put your product into their sort of AI context and help work with it. And that whole idea and that then unlocks all this ability to kind of compose and bring in value from other MCP and other products into your model context to really get maximum utility. And I think the companies that are just stuffing AI into their product, it adds value, but it misses a big opportunity. And I think increasingly they're gonna miss the boat on what's coming. I think really where you get the most value out of sort of these models is where you kind of push your product out there to share from the model's knowledge. And you end up having to spend a lot of time kind of putting that model into your product and development. And the thing is, by the time we've done that, the whole world's moved on by 6 months and you're working with older models and you're not up to date with the latest things. So I think, for me, I can see why companies do it. They're doing it to protect their revenue and try and keep everybody in their ecosystem. But I think, the theme for me that came out of a lot of these conversations, this idea of, that is going to hold them back, and they're going to have to very quickly get used to figuring out how to get their value from putting, inverting that thing and using MCP and similar sort of tools to get their product out there. Otherwise, they're going to get left behind by what's going on. So, I mean, there wasn't a lot of specific things, I think, other than I felt like MCP, a lot of companies aren't really looking at it enough in depth yet. I think they might have played around with it, but they've kind of left it alone and went back to this idea of let's just put agents in our product. And I saw that as a theme throughout, actually, the conversations I had. Not a lot of people are really working with MCP right now.
I agree, and I think it's interesting. Maybe there's another read on that. I think big companies might find it a bit of a setback to actually explore this new avenue with MCP and of course and MCP apps because it's basically it would basically mean that they need to divert a lot of resources, time, effort, people into diving into something that it's a bit unclear, right? So you need to make your way through all of this that is happening in the MCP world, and then if you add that to the fact that basically the ChatGPT App Store is maybe lacking some capabilities that clearly explain how your product would benefit from that, then I can understand why bigger companies they might be a bit more wary of doing that step, and they might be trying to lock down basically all the work that they've been doing in the past years or months. So if they already have agents inside the product, I think that's why they think they might be safer in a safer position just by continuing the work on that rather than jumping onto something completely new. I think that's something that we'll see is different between bigger companies or more established companies and probably like startups that are born like within this new world already, right?
Yeah. What do you think, Ray? What's your take on that?
I think that your point about conservatism is a point that's well taken. And I think we're going to see there are some companies that are, leaning forward into it, and then there are companies that are going to be hanging back. And usually the companies that lean forward into it are the ones who have less to lose. That's why you tend to see startups, particularly at the beginning of these cycles, right? And they're looking to win new business where the incumbents can't go or have a harder time going. And incumbents want to keep what they have, right? Want to iterate to help their current customers better. The late Clay Christensen called this disruptive innovation, right? The idea that like, where the future is going is not necessarily good for your customers today. So the people who have the customers today want to help serve them better, while at the same time because of the rest of it isn't quite ready for their current customers. In the meantime, it keeps on getting better, and then that sort of disrupts the vendor. And so the observation is that often the way this goes is not so much, hey, the incumbent companies adapt to it. It's the new companies come in and disrupt or displace the incumbents or acquire them or what have you, because that sort of becomes the inversion of where that value comes from. So, you know, I think that when we're looking to sell these things, right, you're going to find that it's going to be more often companies that are upstarts, right, or don't have a strong play in the market, that are going to be doing the bigger steps forward, right? And that the incumbents are going to be taking the smaller steps. And if you're going to a conference and the way they select people to speak at the conference are going to be the people who have the bigger names behind them, you're going to be hearing more about the conservatism than you're hearing about the innovation. And so there's a little bit of like, sort of taking a reverse model. Instead of asking who's the most credible people here who have the biggest brands behind them, you flip it, who have the smallest brands behind them, because those are people who are doing the stuff that gives us an indication of what's coming down the pike. And usually the rules of disruptive innovation, like the way Christensen saw it, was like measured in years, maybe like even a couple of decades. He gave the example like disk drives, right, which were iterating pretty fast by his standards, like once every 18 months, something like that. And now it's like, wait, 18 months? How about 18 weeks? How about 18 days between these models that are coming out here? And so, like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that disruption is going to hold up even over the course of. I'm not sure that the attempt to hold it back holds up even over the course of a quarter. But I'm really curious, like, when you're talking to these people who have that somewhat more conservative view, what parts of AI, of the, either being agentic or the interface, are they bringing into their products that can give us insight, right, into what might be coming down the road on the MCP app front?
I mean, for the most part, it was really sort of simple stuff, right? I mean, there's a couple of people I spoke to who were just using it they weren't really agentic behaviors. It was more like a better help service to help them figure out or use their product. So, for example,
Yeah.
there's one company I spoke to that used AI to help the users, but they had a very complex UI. And,
Mhm.
the normal process of the setup would be that, a user would have to learn the platform to figure out how to customize it for their use case to make it really useful. And they were using AI, I guess partly authentically, but basically to help to guide the user in simplifying the setup of their UI to make it useful for the customer. And for me, it's kind of like that's a good first step. But really, if you took the long view on this, it's why not just get the AI to generate the user interface that you need as you do your use case? Just flip it all
Yep.
around. And I think that's kind of where the power of this comes from. And everyone's stuck with the people that are stuck with trying to keep their products the same. I think they'll get some benefit, but they'll miss a big opportunity. As you said, it's coming incredibly fast. And somebody starting now with that more sort of start with the context first and feed the things you need into it, they're going to be able to iterate much faster and take more of the opportunity. I mean, I think a really interesting example, talking about the incumbents, the thing that was interesting for me was another one of our talks we went to, which was Figma. So Figma, the guy who basically is leading the project for MCP at Figma I was talking about what they did. And what's interesting for me is Figma's like an interesting example because it is an incumbent, right? But it's doing serious MCP innovation because it's really screwed. I mean, I think everyone's seen the share price of Figma over the last few months has gone down a lot. I mean, it's still a great product, but they've seen, I think, a huge shift of the sort of design thoughts space, or the thinking space, has moved from let's do everything with Figma and prototype with Figma to let's just use Lovable, let's use Cursor, let's use Claude directly to do interactive designs. And then, and so a lot of the steps in design that used to be done in Figma are being done elsewhere. I think Figma still used a lot for the sort of tweaking of design. But I think even you, JC, right, you use Figma Make, which is kind of one of these tools to do a lot of the interactive prototyping, rather than, just everything in Figma design, which is where it used to be. And I think what Figma's having to do is it really rejigged things a lot, I think, last year, when it started adding in Figma Make. And Figma Make was very much added in sort of a last minute. I think the project was started 2 months before it was launched. So it wasn't very well integrated. And they're trying to integrate it more now. But, this idea of them being an incumbent, but actually moving fast because they can see the potential of it and the fact they have to innovate because their market share is being massively reduced is kind of been triggering that. And I think what was particularly interesting for me about Figma is they've really gone all in on this. I was talking to the guy afterwards and he was saying that they're pushing MCP everywhere. All their tooling can use MCP, can be driven through MCP now, and it's creating really cool workflows. He gave one example, so I may have mentioned before, where they were building, they were basically connecting their Figma MCP to their code base, and they said, right, Figma MCP, build me a fig jam of the flow of the code, right? So they could see that, and so it automatically generated that code, which is really nice. But then they adjusted it and said, right, let's change it collaboratively to work out how they want the flow to work. And they then said, okay, now take the flow and change the code to match the flow. So it's kind of that whole loop is being connected back. And I think that's really one of the great examples of the use of MCP, where you can kind of take these multiple independent pieces of work and use the context of the LLM to kind of add all together and make it much more valuable. So I think, you're right, Ray, just to summarize, I think you are definitely right in that there's definitely a hesitation for these companies to iterate, but there are some of these big incumbents that can see what's coming and are trying to take advantage of it.
That's a fair
Uh,
point. Fear makes people change. When
Sure.
so just being large isn't necessarily a thing. It's when they're large and think that they are stable, right? And what they have is the cash cow, and they're trying to milk that cash cow, as opposed to they're
Yeah.
worried about its decline, and now they're reinvesting in it to sort of try to bring it through that product portfolio life cycle. JC, I'd love to get your take on all this.
I was trying to also wrap my head around why we see these different behaviors in different builders and companies, and I think what I see and hear a lot is that some companies are still, yeah, and we can see that these are usually the more stable or conservative ones. They are still thinking about AI or agents or MCP as well, as a way to, again, add another layer to the product, rather than
Hmm.
flipping it and use it the way that we are discussing in these episodes. And that is usually, I think, because of two things, apart from all that we've been discussing. To me, it all comes down to basically human curiosity. So I do see how many developers and designers or product people in different companies, they are interested in what's happening, right? And they are looking for ways to either make the product better or make their workflows better, like the guys of Figma, or it might be for a bunch of other reasons. But there's some drive just to fulfill some, I think, more basic curiosity on, okay, let me play around with this thing, which sounded to me that was what Figma people were doing a bit. Like they saw there was something new and they were like, okay, let me play around with it. And then it became sort of a thing in the team and everyone was excited about the results that we're getting. And then they decided to adopt it and build the Figma MCP and everything kind of snowballed from there. So to me, I think there's a bit of that curiosity that might be lacking in some teams and that might hinder them in adopting these new technologies, as it often happens. And then the other thing I see is that in the case of Figma, if we take Figma, for example, the fact that they innovate on actually making this FigJam with the code, let's say visualization or map, and then they are able to apply that to their own work in Figma. They are their own users. Like the Figma teams, they are their own users and they eat their own dog food. So they actually need to improve the way they work and how they work. So I think that also drives a lot of the innovation. Whereas what I see in other products that are not don't necessarily mean that their own employees are their own or builders are their own users. What you see is that these people they usually still see AI or agentic flows as a support tool. Like I don't see that going beyond chatbots. Like that's still stuck in that kind of era.
Yeah.
So those are the two kind of conclusions that I can draw from what I hear and see in different teams.
JC, just to touch on the Figma thing. I mean, the specifically, I mean, obviously this is your kind of wheelhouse. What would you say? How have you seen the sort of usage of Figma and the different tooling around it? Because I think your flow has changed a bit, right? I mean, you've experimented a bit using Figma directly, Figma design, and then you played a bit with some of the cursor for a bit, and I think you're currently using Figma Make. So maybe you just talk a little bit, because interesting you say that specific example about how your sort of workflows changed over the last couple of months because of what you picked up on, and potentially where would you see MCP being, or how has MCP impacted that directly?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a whole thing to unpack because I'm trying to also catch up with how quickly I am changing my ways of working, right? So, uh, but if I try to understand where I come from, so I come from a design background. So Figma was my only place. Like also when only Figma files existed, that was the only thing you could do in Figma, right? Then they added FigJam, which is more of a let's say high level or abstract level for your design thinking. So I had FigJam and Figma that kind of helped me understand my two ways of working, more abstract, more down to earth and intangible UI elements. Then when Figma Make uh, came to be, there was a whole different possibility right there. So now I can basically use Figma Make to prototype, and if I want, I can code everything and then export it from there, right there. But I could also, I now can prototype, take care of all the interactions, and I will be doing that by using human language. So that my input to make is again just my thinking. So what I've seen is really helpful in my workflow today is that I use different AI. So I use ChatGPT as my orchestrator. So it's my kind of it's my CPO, co-CPO. So I try to think with it how to best approach the product thinking, how the product should behave, how the user journey should be, how the UI and UX and interaction should be. Once I have all that locked down, then I go to Figma Make and basically create the whole thing and then keep iterating and refining. So, but I still use ChatGPT as an orchestrator. Then my, let's say, handoff happens either in Figma Make. So if I need to have any design, that's usually Figma Make, or I might take something from Figma Make that I want to maybe specifically refine myself manually, and I move it over to Figma. So that's usually my flow to today. And then to your question about MCPs, I think what I've been using more and more lately is Figma MCP to do development work. So if I'm developing something and I happen to be also the designer, which is usually the case, I do this flow that I just described, where I end up with a Figma Make website, let's say. Then if I need anything, like any UI element in specific that I need to basically turn into let's say it's a dashboard. I take everything from Figma Make, take that dashboard, put it in my Figma file, my traditional Figma file, and then from there, I have connected my Figma MCP to my Claude, my Claude account. So then I can just import everything from using Figma MCP, and it will respect it like 99% in most cases, which is insane. So now what I have is like a complete loop as a designer and developer that I have full control over. And I think I'm not even, I don't think I've yet realized how powerful that is. And that's what I'm also seeing other designers doing, and product people in general. I think what it unlocks is you now, as a not only a designer but as a product manager, for example, you have full control over every part of the product lifecycle. So
It's pretty cool. I've been just as an aside, another. I just highlighted another slightly different topic, which was interesting when I was speaking to an investor actually over that week who was in. There's a lot of investors in town, and one of the things that struck me with that was I don't think it's a similar story to that we hear a lot, but there's a lot of roles that I don't think we realise that will be impacted by some of the stuff that's changing. It's not strictly about MCP, but more generally AI. He was talking about how he's invested in a AI film studio, right? And people talk about how AI can replace individuals doing manual tasks, but he was saying, he didn't realise himself that having one person be able to create an entire scene in a movie means all those jobs, set design, costume design, best boy, grip, huge chunks of people would not be required if you're just doing it all generating AI. And I think it's those sorts of snippets of conversation that you realize that this is actually, there's going to be very big impacts on things you wouldn't have thought of, a sort of secondary impacts rather than necessarily the first thing. But there's lots of roles that are going to be impacted this that we haven't even thought about just yet. Rather than just the standard office workers, it's going to have secondary impacts all over the place. That and that's coming soon. As you said, it was amazing how good some of the AI filmmaking has got now. But I guess this is one of those other sides. And then I would say probably the last conversation I should probably talk about, which was interesting for me, was speaking to basically an agency based here who has built a lot of work for big companies. And we were talking about MCP, and what he was saying was that there's been, the general feeling that he saw was that there's a lot of people interested in MCP, some are doing experiments. There wasn't a lot of take up. And I think a lot of the initial work around people building around MCPs has been replacing existing flows and doing very simple replicating apps or parts of apps. I don't think there was a lot of thought about trying to focus on that sort of composable nature where you can build things together. And so, what our discussion was really around what's holding it back. And I think what we came to the conclusion was actually we need to have more examples of people making really strong workflows using these tools and focus on the classic analogy is focus on the hole rather than the drill. I think a lot of MCP has been sold so far on being drills and like this is all this functionality you can do, isn't it amazing? And less about what is the actual benefit to the user and how can we really leverage MCP to make the models work much better for you in a more effective way, and think of sort of models first rather than, oh, I can't, this is a bit annoying. I wonder if the model can do this part. It's let's look at my whole flow. Let's try and think of it as being based around the model first. How do I use the model as much as possible and then worry about the pieces at the end? And I think for me, one of the things that we need to do in these podcasts and on call is really to think about how we can sort of show off some of these flows. And I think the Excalibur video we did was a good example of that. How do we kind of highlight the composability, the power of this composability, rather than just talk about, oh, we can do this exact same functionality in this app in MCP, and it may have some benefit. Focus on the benefit first, and driving it through the model rather than the other way around.
Definitely.
I hear that. The composability also, I think, is something that incumbents will like less than startups will. Because
Yes.
composability means I can focus on my one thing, right? And just take like using the Excalibur example, right? Like how I use Crisp, right, which is an AI noise reduction tool that also got into the automatic transcription game, right? So I've got a bunch of transcripts from meetings, and the and just recently Crisp came out with an MCP server, and you better believe I plugged my MCP server into my Claude, and now I can sort of ask Claude, hey, meeting I was having with X person. In fact, let's look at like all the meetings I had with that person. Like what's
Nice.
the arc of those conversations? And that allows me to be looking at that data in a way that like the, meeting by meeting transcript would never have been able to provide. And yet they didn't have to put in any more functionality, right, for me to get more
Yeah.
value out of it. And now that's making the whole thing stickier. But then you take like the Excalibur example, right? It's like, okay, well, there's a lot going on here, and you're giving me this wall of text. How can I understand this better? And the thing I've learned is that walls of text are great for AI to feed into the next thing because that's how AI thinks in text. But many of the rest of us, don't. And that's one of the reasons why the Excalibur is great because it gives me sort of this visual representation. So now I can take that Crisp, I can take that Excalibur, I can say, let's look at like what's the timeline, right, of what was happening when and how views on this particular topic were changing and sort of track that. Oh, okay, well, it seems to happen with this date. Let's feed that back now. Okay, what else was happening around that date in the market so to get a better understanding of how this whole thing works. And I can have that interactive, flow where I can now bring other external, web research information in along with the Crisp, along with the other. The value here is that Excalibur could just be making really good diagrams. Crisp can just be doing what it does really well, which is record and transcribe, and then just sort of serve up through a table stakes. It's not a particularly good search engine, but who cares? Because you're going to let the AI handle it from there. And as a result, these little startups or this open startups and open source thing are able to create a lot more value than what some of the bigger players are trying to sort of wrap up into a single offer. And there may be value to that single offer, but the power I'm able to get, I use the absolute best of the models, right? And the best of these various pieces. And it doesn't cost me anything to put them together. I'm not putting in the time, the code to do that. The AI is putting those things together for me, really
Yeah.
changes the cost proposition of that and therefore the value. And like if I'm a big company, I'm trying to justify my higher price points, and a lot of that is sort of I'm giving you everything you need. And a startup can say, I'm going to compete with you just on this one thing. And previously, I couldn't compete with you just on that one thing because the customer wants more than just that one thing. But now, if I can be throwing into AI, if I can use it with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, then the composition is super cheap for me to do now in a way that was very expensive or hard for me to do before. That's why a la carte mainly something you sold at the enterprise level as opposed to selling it at the small medium business level. And that's a that's a sea change. And so like that's one of the reasons why when I look at some of these startup type folks, I'm seeing more of this innovation, but I'm also seeing in the customers, they are starving for this innovation, right? Because when you give it to them, they say, "Oh, wait, hey, that's really useful," and that allows them to win a lot more business.
No, and I think it's interesting because it kind of ties it back to the original part of this conversation where we talked about, companies being resistant to this new stuff coming. I think this is a kind of one of the key parts of it. A lot of these companies have, I think, according to Dr. Rose, enshittified their businesses, right? They had something quite good. They added more features. They had to grow the revenue, so they added more features and more features and more features. But because you were in their silo of the app, that data wasn't available to go anywhere else. You had to use their feature. And what MCP does is it allows you to pull that data out and do it somewhere else. So, if their company didn't have a really good report generation that you wanted, a particular way, or an output you wanted, you could just connect. In theory, MCP would allow you to get to that data and put it somewhere where it can. So, the companies that don't have only got a couple of interesting points of really strong value within their application. They're going to be really susceptible to somebody coming in if they open up their MCP servers and are not careful, and having somebody then pull the value out from them. So I think that's why they're resisting it. And yet it's coming, right? So, somebody that could provide those valuable features which do allow that is going to be a preferable option. So, I think this is what I'm kind of starting to say to people is, look, I think you've got to look at it in this perspective. This change is happening. You need to allow people to have this flexibility because they want to be able to do what they want with their own data, and just containing it within your data silo, app silo, is going to help you for a bit, but it's not going to be good for the long term. And you need to be able to adapt and allow, because also I think, really the MCP for me is like the way to really open up the agent behavior. If your data is available through MCP, then agents can start playing around with it, and it opens up even more use cases. So, this is something you're really going to have to do. And I think that's the message I think we really want to work on in these podcasts, is to help people understand this and say, this is a train you need to get on earlier rather than later, because otherwise you ain't going to get to where you want to get to.
I think that's right. And I think also the expression long term, I think might give inappropriate comfort, right, to people who are, hanging on a little bit.
Yeah,
I really I've been saying a lot medium term because I do think it's more like 18 weeks than 18 months for something that has a
yeah, true.
long time horizon. And I'm looking, I mean, that's how much more disruption we're going to get between now and the next time we get to record.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool.
All right. And we will keep on doing that, looking at looking at best practices, looking at what we're learning and seeing in the market as we all attend these events and talk with market leaders, and and we'll keep that going on in the short term and in the medium term.
Absolutely.
Of course. Thank you so
Thanks
much,
so much,
guys.
gentlemen. This was great.
Thanks, guys.
We'll do this
Bye.
again soon.
Bye bye.